Welcome to our discussion on one of the top energy sources, headline energy sources that we're very excited about today, green hydrogen. It is green hydrogen's moment in the sun. The IEA, just to set the stage for the discussion, forecasts that green hydro will fulfill 10% of our energy needs by 2050. When we talk about green hydrogen, just to make sure everyone is in the loop on this, we're referring to hydrogen created with renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels, which would be all the other different colored hydrogens, blue, gray, brown. That will largely be seen initially in some of the hardest to abate sectors. Heavy industry, primarily the iron and steel sector, emits around 7% of the world's carbon dioxide, more than all of the world's cars combined. It cannot be phased out unless we don't want buildings or appliances or all those important things. And this is something that the U.S. has invested in heavily over the course of the past couple of years. In fact, the Department of Energy is in the process right now of vetting proposals from 8 to 10 regional hydrogen hubs around the United States. They will invest $8 billion in those all around the country. One of them we actually just highlighted in a foreign policy analytics report, which you can find online. It's with the Joint Center for Development and Research in Earth Abundant Materials, or JC Dream, with Washington State University. And you can find that research at jcdream.org. But what I'd really like to kick off on is with our excellent panelists. I'm joined by Ambassador Pyatt, Todd Clewett of Fortescue Future Industries, and Landon Derentz from the Atlantic Council, our good friend. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. But I'd love to go to you, Ambassador Pyatt, right off the bat, and talk a little bit about what's happening globally. There's obviously a tremendous amount of energy and focus on this in the United States. And you were just mentioning in the fantastic discussion that we had in the green room right now that I wish we were having on stage as well, but let's replicate it right now. You're just coming out of and continuing with a bilateral with your Australian counterpart and talking about these very issues right now.
No, that's exactly right, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation. One of the good fortunes I had last year was to be confirmed as Assistant Secretary at exactly the moment that Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Obviously, a hugely important moment in terms of America's climate policy and the credibility that we bring to the table. But it's also incredibly exciting in terms of the acceleration that the IRA is catalyzing in some of these key industries, like green hydrogen, like carbon sequestration, and in particular, and of great importance, the diversification of clean tech supply chains to reduce the vulnerability that we face because of China's overwhelming domination of a lot of these key markets of the future. So it's been incredibly exciting to me as I've gone around the world and engaged in lots of these energy dialogues with Japan, with India, with Korea, with the European Union, to see how America's leadership has moved the needle in terms of how the market is thinking about the role that green hydrogen is going to play in the decarbonization of these hard-to-abate sectors that you talked about, like steel, like heavy transportation, like chemicals, but also what we can do just over the next couple of years to go after a sector, industrial hydrogen, 3% of global CO2. So just cleaning up that sector alone will bring material climate benefits. So it's a very exciting time. As you mentioned, I'm in the middle of our annual energy security dialogue with Australia. It's been a fantastically positive conversation, including about green hydrogen because of the leadership that some Australian companies like Fortescue are playing in this space, but also because we're allies. And I'll finish up on this point. The green hydrogen is not just a climate answer. It also goes to the new world that we have encountered following Vladimir Putin's weaponization of Russia's oil and gas resources, and the imperative of building a more diverse and secure energy supply chain to the future. And that's the exciting part about the green hydrogen opportunity.
And one last point on this. You were just mentioning this is happening very quickly, and it's a big transformation, and we all are going to be learning a tremendous amount about hydro and going forward. But maybe you could just share that one quick anecdote that you mentioned about coming back from COP27 in your morning meeting with the seniors at the State Department.
No, well, as I was sharing with you, Andrew, I had the opportunity to be part of the U.S. delegation to COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, and when I walked into our senior staff meeting at the department, first day back in the office, I said, we are all going to have to learn a lot more about green hydrogen. because this is going to be rippling across the global energy marketplace, and it's going to have significant geopolitical impacts as well. And our challenge, my challenge in ENR, where we think about the geopolitics of energy, is to make sure that we leverage America's leadership in this space to strengthen our alliances, to help make our allies and partners more secure, but also to advance the urgent climate requirements that we face.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing, Ambassador. Todd, would love to bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit about Fortescue Futures Industries. And Fortescue, generally, a real leader in the hydrogenization of the mining sector, if that's an accurate term. I don't know if I can activate that. A massive mining company in Australia. Your leader, Andrew Fortescue, is pledged to be carbon neutral by 2030, very focused on producing hydrogen in the mining sector. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what Fortescue is doing and why you're doing this, why you're undertaking this in a leadership role.
Okay, so just sort of following on from the Ambassador's point, Andrew started 2 or 3 years ago, going around the world because Andrew Forrest saw a future in green hydrogen and talking to countries around the world and seeing, if they were interested or had the appetite to work with us to create this industry. Fast forward 3 years post IRA, what the Ambassador says has come true. It's like what we saw those first days is people just staring blankly at us. And then what we see today is an acceptance that this is a real industry and it's going to be 10% of the energy mix going forward. So in terms of the question, what does Fortescue do? We're a huge honking mining organisation. We're a big emitter. And we committed to decarbonising our whole mining operations by 2030. So we are, with mining trucks that are bigger than this room, mining trains, our shipping fleet, we are investing to decarbonise and put into that machinery and infrastructure hydrogen-related and renewable fuel cells. Separate to decarbonising the mining sector, we are investing in green hydrogen globally, and we want to be one of the first movers creating large-scale supply of green hydrogen globally. We have committed this year to get 5 projects to FID. So early on, people would say, what's the problem with green hydrogen? It's too far away. Well, it's not too far away anymore, and it's in part because of the US administration, in big part because of the US administration, but companies like ours and other big companies have said, right, we're just going for it.
And tell us a little bit about your view of the IRA and how this impacts development projects globally. One of the things you were saying is that the US is now the most attractive place to invest in some of these projects. It's sucking all the attention out of the rest of the world. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, and it's not even close. So one of the challenges in a new industry is we got to compete with alternative fuels, blue hydrogen, diesel, oil and gas. And what the IRA and green hydrogen, the challenge was always that we could figure out how to produce it, but the cost was too high. The IRA made it profitable to do this in the USA. So what that means is all the investment decisions head towards the USA now. And so that's great because the USA has in fact made it profitable. And so there's a singular and critical benefit to that globally because we pilot it, we test it out, we prove the green hydrogen supply chains can work. Rich countries like the EU, like Japan, like Canada, and hopefully Australia, post your meetings with the ambassador, have responded. And it will be profitable in those countries as well. But there are many countries in the developing world who've got great resources and great potential to be exporters of green hydrogen who can't afford that. So we need to figure out ways of getting them in the game. And so that's where I think Rachel Kite's comments before are very important. The MDBs, World Banks, etc., they've got a role to play here to get some of those developing countries like Namibia, like Morocco, like Oman, Chile into the game here.
And that'd be a great point to go to, Landon, on and talk a little bit about what we're seeing globally. There's quite a few examples of excellent projects and initiatives that are occurring cross-border. Maybe you could share with us some examples of what you've seen at the Atlantic Council, specifically on that cross-border initiative where there's been help and cooperation to work on projects between countries.
You know, Andrew, I think I find the conversation about this green hydrogen renaissance really fascinating, especially in the context of energy security. You know, hydrogen discovered in the 1700s, the first electrolyzers in 1800, and it was kind of largely put on the shelf for the last 200 years, and now we're bringing it back. And it's not being brought back because of energy security initially, it's being brought back because of the climate imperative, right? It's about economic competitiveness in a net zero world for the industrialized countries. I think, you know, if you're looking at the developing world, maybe lower or mid-tier income countries, there's also a unique opportunity to monetize a rich resource base because a lot of these countries are in Africa or other parts of the world in the Middle East. So you're looking at corridors from the UAE to Egypt to Mauritania, maybe Namibia, people, you know, countries that are on shipping lines that really make this a valuable asset to them. And I think now, to the ambassador's point, we're also compounding this on energy security from an aspect of being able to have even a more diverse energy mix. I would say, you know, a note on energy security, though, too, when you think about investments, when you go back to COP27 and you look in Sharm el-Sheikh, when the Egyptians announced their efforts to really pursue aggressively a green hydrogen engagement, and I think the first project is maybe 100 megawatts, and it's intended to produce green ammonia. A lot of investment is coming from countries like UAE, and these are countries in the Middle East that have a historic footprint in the fossil energy. And energy security to them in this component isn't how we're thinking about it in the context of Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. It's about having an economic livelihood in a future that may diminish the value of conventional energy resources.
And indeed, a lot of the oil majors are also very seriously considering and looking at this as a new path for them. It's even changing the nature of their lobbying organizations. We were chatting about that as well. They have to consider the mix of the projects that these companies are undertaking. And Ambassador, you were really saying also that that is what gives you a bit of positive hope that there will be scalable, genuine development here. Because once the majors start looking at this as a viable business and future for them, then the investment comes pouring in and suddenly it grows.
No, I think this is very much Todd's point. The Rubicon has already been crossed, and it's the fact that you have big companies like AES and ExxonMobil that have made large commitments here in the United States on the Gulf Coast. The fact that there is so much interest in how to go after that gray hydrogen market and replace that as quickly as possible in the next couple of years with blue or green hydrogen, but also what's happening in other countries. I was in India in January. India has made a very large, Prime Minister Modi has made a very large commitment to India's hydrogen future, arguably the most consequential country in the entire world in terms of our climate future because of its size, because of the energy demands that India is going to have in the future. And you have big Indian companies like Reliance and Tata that have committed to completely decarbonizing their energy businesses using principally the incentives around green hydrogen. I was with Prime Minister Shmyhal of Ukraine last week. The Ukrainians, a country that was the Texas of the former Soviet Union, the Ukrainians are very serious about developing hydrogen linked to their very large nuclear fleet as part of their post-war energy future. Their leaders talk about Ukraine becoming the power bank of Europe, a resource for the whole continent. The same thing is happening in Latin America. I was with the Chilean ambassador a couple of days ago. I'll be in Trinidad and Tobago in 2 weeks. TNT is also looking at this sector. So this is happening. What's exciting about it also is how it opens the potential that in the relatively near future, within this decade, you are going to have a world where green hydrogen is incorporated to get after the very hardest sectors, including long-haul trucking here in the United States. It is a source of concern that today 95% of the hydrogen fuel cell trucks in the world are produced in China. We have to change that. And that's one of the things that the IRA is intended to accomplish.
Let's talk about China for a moment. You hadn't mentioned them until just now, and obviously in the world of geopolitical competition and at foreign policy, any conversation can't go too long without mentioning China. Where do we sit vis-a-vis the U.S. and the rest of the world versus China and their position on this? You had mentioned earlier that China, like everything else, controls 50% of the electrolyzer market right now, but is the #1 user of industrial hydrogen. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about our future and working with China and where they fit into the green hydrogen mix.
So first principle, I think we have lived through an extraordinarily stressful year in the transatlantic energy relationship. We are all enormously encouraged that we have successfully disarmed Vladimir Putin's energy weapon. But it was striking to me when I was last in Brussels about 3 weeks ago how quickly the conversation evolved from we cannot allow a situation where Europe's former dependence on Russian oil and gas is replaced with dependence on Chinese clean tech supply chains. And the IEA, in its energy technology report, has laid out all the dimensions of that vulnerability. It's critical minerals, it's hydrogen electrolyzers, it's silicon wafers and solar modules, it's electric vehicles, where Chinese companies are moving very, very aggressively, not into the U.S. market, but in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in South America, next door in Mexico. They are everywhere. So we have to recognize this as one of the fundamental geopolitical challenges that we have right now. What gives me great encouragement is the fact that our companies here in the United States are moving so ambitiously into this space, and we're doing so with allies and partners. Along with my Australia dialogue today, we're also hosting, of course, President Yoon is here with about 150 Korean companies. I've had the opportunity to talk to the CEOs of LG and Hanwha and a number of other Korean companies, all of whom are extraordinarily focused on the opportunity, the investment opportunity that this energy transition provides, and the opportunity to do a lot of their work and a lot of their manufacturing here in the United States. So this is a incredibly important issue in terms of the new global map of energy that we're talking about. But it's also central to America's future economic and industrial competitiveness.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Todd, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about how Fortescue views this market. I know Andrew Forrest's vision and his drive to make this happen quickly, which is incredible, that you have 5 projects underway right now. There are tremendous technical challenges here, and I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit of insight on what some of those are. Hydrogen, more explosive than diesel, difficult to store in any format. We haven't even talked about leakage. Maybe we could talk just a little bit about how Fortescue is solving for that problem. And the ambassador asked an awesome question backstage that I'll repeat. Does Fortescue looking at their leadership and your leadership in this space as one in which you're going to be a mining company that just uses hydrogen? Or is this a market opportunity for Fortescue in and of itself within hydrogen as a product and all the tools that you're building around it?
Oh, yeah, to answer the second question first, yeah, we see the opportunity here not just to be a hydrogen provider and supplier at large scale, but to commercialise and monetise the lessons we are learning as we decarbonise the mining sector. So the products that we create, whether they be mining trucks, mining locomotives, ships, etc., all have application in the mining sector, but beyond the mining sector. So we see that as sort of the broad suite of opportunities here. And it's important to say, we are decarbonising by 2030 and we're doing so profitably. Right, so we spend $6.5 billion to eliminate carbon from the whole mining operation. The net benefit's around $800 million a year. So it's not doing it out of the goodness of our heart. We're doing it because it can make sense. And if we prove that is profitable, then every other mining company should do the same. There are inevitably, as you scale up any industry, technical challenges. But to the ambassador's point before, let's not be too scared by this sort of any sense that hydrogen is especially problematic. The industrial hydrogen sector exists in the world today. I think 12 million tonnes of hydrogen is produced and consumed in the US right now. There's a hydrogen pipeline network in Texas. The refineries in Texas and California already use hydrogen. The space shuttle uses hydrogen. what we're saying is you can use and utilise the understanding of the safety, of the transportation issues that's already in place, but replace the energy source from being at a fossil fuel source to a renewable source. So we think that's a big part of the story. There are other questions around leakage which are important to address. We're addressing those. We're working with the EDF to make sure that the leakage is manageable. We think it's a minor issue, but one that you need to get on top of quickly. I think the big issue technically is transportation. So transportation, turning hydrogen into ammonia and then back into hydrogen, you get to the other place. That's still quite expensive. So that's one of the sort of the technical challenges.
One of the things that I'm finding, and as I school up on green hydrogen as well, is how little we all understand it. To Ambassador Pyatt's point, talking to Anthony Blinken's breakfast team on schooling up on it. Tell us a little bit about those transportation particulars. So you turn it into ammonia and then you crack it back into hydrogen and when it lands at its destination. And you mentioned there are a couple of different ways that I'd love to talk a little bit about that transit as well.
So you probably need others to talk more about the technical stuff. But if you go to Rotterdam Port right now and you go to Corpus Christi in Texas, those ports are putting in place ammonia crackers to do exactly that. I'll get the science wrong, but hydrogen is a less dense source of energy. You've got to make it smaller. You can do that by adding the chemical that turns it into ammonia, transportation as ammonia, and then crack it back on the other end.
Got it. Thank you for explaining.
Andrew, can I expand on a little bit of what Todd's saying here? I think it's really important to be honest about the chemistry of hydrogen, right? It is the smallest molecule. It does have a lower energy density by volume, but it's not a problem, right? These are things that we solve for. And I think about going back to IEA reports a decade ago, and you'd look at the long-term forecast of where energy supply needed to be to achieve net zero, and we'd have a huge chunk that was just innovation. And I think, increasingly we have technologies that are filling those chunks, but we're still innovating over a transition, right? This isn't tomorrow. We're talking about large-scale deployment in 2026, 2030, right? And so I think we have an existing gray industrial base of gray hydrogen, and we know that we can flip that into a clean resource. And so I think when you couple the climate imperative and the just ingenuity and know-how that we can deploy over the next couple of decades, green hydrogen really has a viable path here.
Outstanding.
And can I just sort of add, the people who are doing this stuff now are used to these problems.
Right.
So the big mining guys, the big oil and gas guys, they're the people who go into countries and they say, you can't do that. And the engineers find a way to do it. I spent 5 years in remote Panama building a copper mine to export copper to the world. People say, you can't do it. Of course you can do it. The people who solve those tough, crunchy challenges are the people who are applying themselves to this specific challenge. The oil and gas industry, the mining industry, big infrastructure projects, sometimes in difficult spots. See, that's our jam, as I say.
Can I just, Andrew, a quick point to add on this? And I'm sort of reflecting on my time in Greece, where I got to know a lot of billionaire Greek ship owners.
Former ambassador to Greece.
Greece controls 20% of the global LNG fleet. This is one of those areas where urgency matters. Shipping, if it was a country, would be one of the top 10 CO2 emitters in the world. Most ships have a return on investment of 25 to 30 years. So if we want to decarbonize shipping by 2050, we need to start 2 years ago. So, but this is a sector where hydrogen and ammonia is probably going to be one of the key parts of the solution, along with some form of carbon sequestration. And this is where the State Department comes in, because shipping is the quintessential global issue. But shipping has been through transitions before. And I keep saying somebody should write a Harvard Business School study looking at the transition from coal to oil in the global shipping industry 100 years ago. And what are the lessons that portends for this transition away from HFO, away from oil, to green shipping solutions.
And it's so interconnected globally. Maybe you could just share the example of Hanwha and their supply chain, which was a fascinating story. Since you just met with the Korean delegation that was just in town this past week, talking with Chaebol, head of Hanwha, about their process and that circuitous line. It's a fantastic story.
So it's another example of how many pieces are moving. And the one big piece, of course, is that the United States is now the world's largest LNG exporter. We are going to retain that status for years to come. So we have to think about the geopolitical consequences of that and how we leverage that resource, both to make our economy more competitive, but also to support our friends and allies, as we've done in Europe over the past year especially. But the whole market has changed again because of the Inflation Reduction Act. So in the case of Hanwha, for instance, this is a company that is working on upstream LNG liquefaction in Texas, but they also make ships. And so they are looking at the prospect of how to develop a carrier, a ship that could carry LNG in one direction, but CO2 in the opposite direction. So you could imagine gas, which is going to manufacture green steel in Korea, which is a demand of the European market because of the European CBAM, which then produces CO2, which has to go somewhere, can be loaded back onto that ship, brought to someplace else, potentially the United States, or there also are companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, are looking at carbon sequestration projects in Australia, in Indonesia. But you take that carbon to someplace else and you store it geologically. So it's just another reminder of how the global energy map is going to look. This is not your grandmother's oil and gas industry.
We're not sending barrels somewhere, and completely interconnected and taking advantage of a lot of the incentives that we have put in place in these different markets also along the way, which is fascinating.
And the unique, innovative capacity of America's energy industry. And part of the way I think about my job is, just as American companies have led the world globally over the past 100 years of the fossil-focused energy industry, our challenge is to make sure that for the next 100 years, it's also American companies that are leading the way, working with all of the allies and partners that we have around the world in Australia and Japan.
Very smart
and
Australian companies as well, of course. Very good. On that note, Ambassador, fantastic discussion to learn more about what you're hearing and bringing in globally. Todd, the outstanding work that Fortescue Futures and Andrew Forrest are undertaking in the hydrogen work. And of course, Landon, your perspective from the Atlantic Council and what you're seeing globally. Thank you so much for the discussion and joining me today. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andrew.